Fantastic. First of all, thanks for joining us this morning on this beautiful day in San Diego. I am really, really excited to be here with former Mayor Bill de Blasio. And I had not met Bill prior to us agreeing to do this, and as I got to know him, he really had me at hello, because he went to the same high school in Cambridge, Massachusetts as my son, which is the most diverse high school in all of America, right? Kind of a real tribute to good, strong public high schools and what they can do for our children. So right there, now the fact you're a Red Sox fan also endeared me a little bit to you as well, Mayor. But you have a chance now to talk with the 109th Mayor of New York City, who ran the largest city in the country, who ran the largest school system in the country, at a time when he had mayoral control, which obviously not a lot of cities and mayors have mayoral control of their school system. So it put him in a pretty unique position to influence that. Okay, so let's jump right in. You were in charge of the largest school system in America, and you saw firsthand what is working and what is not working for our children, with millions of children in that system. And you envision now a revolution in education. Tell us about the revolution you envision and what animates that.
Thank you so much, Gerald. Thank you, everyone, for being here for this discussion. Gerald, thank you for the thousands and thousands of young people that you've helped on the path to employment. I want to talk to you about that as we go along as well. Everyone, look, I want to speak from someone who's been in the trenches. So we had over 1 million kids in our school system, one of the most diverse places on earth. Immense set of challenges face the kids of New York City every day. And then for 2 of the years I was mayor, we had COVID on top of that. So I'm not speaking to you as a wide-eyed idealist, but as someone who's lived it. My own kids went to New York City public schools as well. Here's the reality. So this conference brings together such great minds for common intent to improve our education system, but I think we need to start having a very different conversation, because I think we are kind of backwards in this country. First of all, we are starting too late. The fact is that, with the exception of some visionary and brave policymakers like Governor Paulson, thank you so much for being with us, most of this country starts too late. About 1/3 of kids in this country get a full-day pre-K. Only 6% of the 3-year-olds. Only 6% of our 3-year-olds get full-day early child education. We are kidding ourselves if we think our education system is going to produce great results if we don't reach children at the time of their greatest intellectual development. And any discussion of resources, and we all understand, anyone who's been around public life knows it goes to resources very, very quickly. We've got to come to grips with the fact that if we're going to be serious about education and we're spending all our resources later, we're just kidding ourselves. We're just ultimately not serving our kids. There has to be a rather radical discussion about reorienting our resources, whether it's getting new resources into education, as the governor did, as I did in New York, or whether it's taking what we have that exists and cutting the pie differently. We have to begin at the beginning. Second of all, we have a governance model that does not work. Look, I have mayoral control of education. As Gerald said, it's rare in this country. But in the end, with all due respect to the many good people who serve on school boards, I was a school board member once myself, generally speaking, the school board model is not serving kids. And it is serving political controversy. We need to think about what it looks like to put elected executives in charge of our schools consistently around the country. If you look at school systems around the world, where they have strong national standards, where they standardize their education across regions to achieve national outcomes, they would never allow a group of individuals to fight their own political battles locally and forget to serve kids. So we have to look at the rest of the world that is achieving more educationally and consider our situation. And I love to talk about education not just in terms of what it means for children and their intellectual development, their emotional development, but think about education as economic policy. That's easy, workforce of tomorrow. But how about thinking about education as well? If you really want to build unity on the issue, think of education in terms of national security. Will we be a strong and safe nation if we continually fall behind in terms of the educational capacity of our children? You know, I think sometimes we have to shake the foundation of the discussion. And if some people are not interested in educating kids or investing in kids because it sounds soft, well, let's remind them that not only our economy, but our future security depends on it. And the countries that are our competitors in the world, and most notably the People's Republic of China, incessantly focus on the education of their children and put a massive investment into that education compared to us and start earlier and more systematically. These are just a few of the things that I think we need to do differently. The last one I'd like to highlight up front, and we have a lot to talk about, and we saw this so deeply during the COVID crisis, is we are only scratching the surface on the notion of social emotional learning. We want our children to succeed academically, and we too often leave out the fact that they cannot succeed academically if they can't succeed emotionally. We have the tools. This is what's so striking to me. We have the tools. We have really advanced models of social emotional learning. We understand what it means to provide children proper support. We have absolutely proven that early childhood education works. We have the curriculum. We have the training capacity. We're not putting the pieces together. And so many educators I've spoken to across the whole country feel this, and a lot of parents as well. They can see it, they can touch it, and they're wondering, why aren't these different dots being connected? And there's a lot of stasis. There's a lot of connection to traditions that are not serving us, that we have to aggressively, radically separate from. But when you think about it, every child in an American school should have access to mental health services in that school. We started down that road in New York City, providing access to professionals to the whole school staff, increasing the number of counselors, but then we got to COVID, and the crisis was so intense, what kids went through. I think we're only beginning to understand how much our kids have been hurt and affected by COVID. We decided to do a mental health screening for literally all 1 million children. It's not the most advanced or developed screening, I'm not going to pretend, but it was a beginning to say we want to get a look at every child respectfully and with the family and figure out if some children need extra support, especially now as they're just feeling the effects of COVID. The point in that is it's not impossible to systematically identify what each child needs emotionally and start to provide that support. If you do that, you open up a world of possibilities for them academically as well. If you don't do it, don't be surprised if that door remains shut. So I've only given you a few examples: the focus on early childhood, the focus on changing the governance model, the focus on mental health and social emotional learning. And there's more to talk about. But my conclusion in this is we're an extraordinary country with extraordinary educators, with parents who care, with endless possibilities as we've always had as Americans, and yet, when it comes to education, we are essentially out of position. And we don't need to be. We don't need to be. And what I hope and pray is conferences like this, gatherings of people who really care, we can start to have that discussion in every corner of this country. We have the tools. It would be a very different discussion if we didn't have the tools. But we actually have them. And we've got to reject a status quo that's not working for our children and our families.
Amen. I think a round of applause for that answer, let me tell you. Thank you. I was on the Board of Education for Massachusetts for 6 years. Our secretary at that point, Secretary Paul Reville, he had a saying. He often said, we have consistently underestimated the effects and the impact of poverty on educational attainment. And he was one of the, I think, most well-thought-of gentlemen in education. And I was curious with that comment, what do you think of Paul's statement in his comment, and how do you think about economic inequality as a contributing factor in input to educational equity?
I think Paul's right, and I think, for every educator out there who has struggled because a child comes forward with all the burdens that our society has unfortunately placed on a lot of families, it's inevitably true that the educator and the school setting can only do so much. So I think there's two ways to think about it. One is let's acknowledge the root causes. One of the things we focused on a lot in New York is just really basic, raising wages and raising benefits for families. When we did pre-K for all, that put a lot of money back in families' pockets. We did free after-school programs. We raised the minimum wage. We provided paid family leave. I mean, these things, every place is different, and some things are more possible in some places than others. But, you know, when you start to relieve that burden of poverty, it opens up immense possibilities educationally. When families are housed as opposed to living in shelter, which comes down to often how much money they have is not a state secret. And we saw, by the way, in the context of the horror of COVID, we saw something rather striking. All of the sudden infusion of resources that happened because of the stimulus and the child tax credit actually lifted an immense number of children out of poverty for a period of time. And again, we have those tools, and that is, to me, an educator's best friend, because a child that's not struggling with poverty, a family that's not struggling with poverty, can focus on the child and their growth. But I think the second point is to say that since we're not going to banish poverty anytime soon, it puts even more of a premium on the reorientation of our school systems. We found that all of the things we did focused on equity, even though we knew we were swimming upstream against income inequality and poverty, all the more reason to fight that battle within, in the good way, within the school system. We did, for example, advanced placement courses in every single high school. We felt this was really important to stop the horrible division where kids who were privileged had access to AP courses, and then we had high schools that had been around for 100 years and didn't have a single AP course because they happened to be in poorer communities. We mandated every high school had to have at least 5 AP courses, and there had to be support for kids who wanted to take those courses. You know, that is an example. All the things you can do that focus on equity, of course, open up opportunity for so many children. But I also want to say there's a powerful message, and I think this gets to the most human and emotional level. I always felt when we were creating Pre-K for All that we were sending a message to poorer families and to kids who are extraordinarily perceptive. I just want to do a show of hands here in the room. How many of you have had a moment where a very young child absolutely blew you away by how much they understood that you thought they didn't understand? That's pretty much everyone. I've had some very striking moments as a parent in particular. I was like, I didn't know you knew that word. The fact is, when you invest in a child, when you invest in a family, they feel it. They know it. It creates a sense of belonging. It creates a sense of meaning and purpose. And part of how we undo that corrosive impact of income inequality is by showing that love, showing that commitment, and people get it. I have to tell one very quick story just because it's just priceless. We started Pre-K for All. And I go to a classroom in Queens, working class district in Queens, and a bunch of kids, and they have, you know, the governor knows when elected officials go to a classroom, you get to read the kids a story, so we're reading the story. The hungry caterpillar, very hungry caterpillar, whichever one it is, he was hungry. And all the kids are totally engaged, like they're really in it, except one. One kid in the back who's kind of staring and seems uninterested, and we get finished with the story. And at the very end, this kid shoots up his hand. So all of you, how many people know the story, the Hungry Caterpillar story? A lot of you? Okay. So the kid shoots up his hand, and I'm kind of happy to see it. And I go, go ahead, what do you want to say? And he looks at me, and he says, he's a 4-year-old, by the way. He looks at me, and he says, metamorphosis. He literally says metamorphosis. And I was like, wow, this is working better than I thought.
I love it. I love it. You remind me when you say that of, at times in teaching in the classes we have around the country, I'll never forget being in a classroom and a young man was sleeping in the classroom. And as someone who's teaching, anyone who's been in a classroom knows that can be not only distracting, but the energy transfer of not paying attention, then it can spread and it can make a very difficult classroom. And I remember thinking before I did Year Up, my assumption was, why is he doing this? Is he somehow disrespecting the classroom? And I've learned now to say, first question, most important question, how are you?
Yeah.
How are you? And this young man raised his head and he said, I was tossed out of my house last night. I slept rough. I still wanted to come to Year Up to be successful in the program, but I am tired as all get out, man. And I remember thinking, how do you start with the questions, right? Be curious rather than judgmental about how are you? And that question's probably helped me learn more in my life, especially with young people who are dealing with a lot. So it's interesting paying attention to that aspect. Now, you've talked about a little bit on national security, which I would agree with, that it's education is linked to national security. Talk about the link between inequity and democracy. And I know that's something you think a lot about and talk a lot about.
Yeah, look, I'm going to be blunt here in a room of good people. I'm not here to talk about anyone's political persuasion. But if you feel there has been a real challenge to our democracy lately, I would say let's go back a step. And it's not just about one political leader or one political party, but it's also about why so many people feel disconnected from our country and our democracy. Because they don't feel a sense of belonging. They don't feel the country's serving them. This has been decades in the making. And put aside, because I'm the first to say with great criticism that some of this has xenophobic elements and racist elements. I'm not missing that. But some of it is honestly about pure economic dislocation and uncertainty and the kind of cultural change that it should not be just laid down to the notion of people don't like folks who look like them or have a different faith or whatever, but folks who see a kind of rapid cultural change they can't make sense of, who feel like, you know, maybe traditional values, including a lot of values that really worked, are being swept aside. So I'm saying that with empathy. The same way you say, how are you? I'm saying, let's say, how are you to our fellow Americans, and you're going to find a lot of people are hurting and they're confused. Well, the reason I say that in terms of education is that we have to understand that that's our best chance to give people a feeling that they do belong when children and families, by the way, and their parents feel the schools are serving them, when they're seeing that investment, when they're seeing that compassion. That is a reminder of how democracy can work. Public education is one of the greatest expressions of democracy ever created. But it's hurting, just like so many other elements of our society. And I think it's really important to say, if you walk through those school doors and your emotional health is being considered, your child is being reached early, there's a sense that the schools are really focused on each child's needs, that is affirming and creates a sense that things can work and things can change. Let alone if you continue that through and teach children their place in society. You know, I think so many of us have had the frustration of what we used to call civics education, which wasn't overly functional, needs a massive update. I believe the best update is to show kids how to participate and get them actually participating early on. I remember vividly being in a neighborhood called Sunset Park in Brooklyn, and a group of fifth graders explaining to me why they wanted vegan meals. And I didn't know fifth graders knew what vegan meals were personally. You know? And so I think that opportunity to help kids determine some of their own destiny in their school and their community, make an impact, active living civics education. And one other thing I'd say, democracy means everyone's represented. And again, with absolute love in my heart for educators, love. The educators of America don't represent, in many ways, just purely by their own lived experience, the children who are going to so many of our public schools. And that is not just true in terms of race and ethnicity, it's that plus gender. One of the things we did in New York City as a beginning is we made a commitment to hire 1,000 men of color teachers. Because look, and Gerald, you and I can say this very openly. When we were coming up, we were blessed with a lot of people who could relate to us as teachers, mentors, whatever it may be, and a lot of role models. And I'm not saying we're living back in our times. Things are much better. But you cannot expect the fullness of success for our children, and particularly our young men of color, if they never see a teacher who they can directly and personally relate to. That is an investment question. It's not that there aren't, as you know better than anyone in the world, it's not that there aren't hundreds of thousands of young men of color who wouldn't be great teachers, wouldn't love to do it, but they are going to need more support and investment to have that opportunity. And so again, think about it this way. If you want education to work and you want democracy to work, a different approach to investing in education early but also a different approach to investing in the people who make up education, the educational system. And that certainly is particularly timely when we have a teacher shortage. What better time to reset the equation in favor of a diverse teaching core?
The program I run and started Year Up is often been called a hack to a broken educational system.
Amen.
And so the question is, why isn't the system working? Why do you need a nonprofit to come in and perform part of these functions? So when you think about the broader systemic changes that you see, the big tectonic plates, you talked about early childhood, social emotional learning, when you think, okay, if I had that magic wand and could make that revolution happen, what are the big systemic changes within education do you think need to be front and center in our minds who are trying to tackle this issue?
Well, look, I think, first of all, I just so deeply appreciate the work you've done, but I think the idea that it's a hack is exactly right. You know, wouldn't it be wonderful if you didn't have to do that work? But unfortunately, you'll be at it for a while, brother. Don't retire now. When I think about the way we approach preparing kids for their future, again, with the incredible efforts of so many educators and school staff of all kinds, and I've seen this front line, and against all odds, you know, folks show up and make an impact. But the weird thing is how disconnected the notion of education is from what happens next. Right. So, you know, I could go on with passion all day, because if you say, well, the governance is off, the timing is off because we start too late, the composition of the teaching core is off, you know, the social emotional learning isn't there yet, we're so out of position, but again, all with things we could fix. Nothing I've said is unfixable. The tools exist right this minute. So then the question on top of all that is, how are we so disconnected from the what's next for our kids? And I think you and I are kindred on this. Happen to be a Democrat, happen to be a progressive, but I believe there's a real place for bringing businesses into schools to start that early connection, high school, even middle school, to employment. I think there is a tremendous need, even though it's gotten better, to break this dichotomy about preparing kids for college or preparing kids for career. That, you know, Gerald mentioned the high school I went to in Cambridge, Mass. Forget all of Harvard and MIT. The rest of Cambridge, Mass. At that time was working class people. And there was a vocational high school and there was an academic high school. And they were perfectly separate, even though they were within a couple hundred feet of each other. Demographically, in terms of vision, in terms of reputation, totally separate. And Cambridge, Massachusetts had the idea to combine them, which was kind of cool. And it worked. And start to break down those walls. But it's 2023, we have not yet broken down those walls. Career, if you look at, I'm not an expert on Germany, but I'll borrow the basic notion. You know, Germany really presents a career path, vocational education, whatever, technical education, whatever you want to call it, CTE, as equal, just plain equal to an academic path, to a college-going path. And in this country where we're seeing this massive political divide, which very much correlates to college education or not, one of the correctives, I think, is aggressively putting both concepts on the same setting. Right. In message, in investment, in vision. But if we're going to do that, we got to stop kidding around on the CTE side of this, right, because it is still a stepchild. Yep. And I think if we're saying to kids from the beginning, and you're so eloquent on the point of the cost of education later on as one of the great inhibitors, so it's almost like if you say to kids, go to college, go to college, go to college, but you can't afford college, it's a total catch-22. Right. I do think, again, we have the tools to prepare kids for career, but it will take a reorientation to truly honoring that in word and deed. Totally.
I think the concept is a child should graduate high school and be adult-ready. Right? What does it mean to be adult-ready? You can do pay-worthy and credit-worthy activity. So in my own state, Massachusetts, the test to get out of high school, MCAS, in no way, shape, or form relates to AccuPlacer, the test to determine whether you can go to college. Now, adults design that system. Can you think of a more cruel way to treat a child than to say, here's how you get out of high school with a thumbs up, or it doesn't match with how you get into college? And we, the adults in the room, design that system. that actually makes kids feel like, wow, I finished high school, I graduated my MCAS, and I can't get into college. Like, who would ever design those systems not to align in that manner? So, we are the adults in charge right now. I want to think a little bit about cradle to career, in that we hear a lot, especially in this conference, around economic mobility, education to work. What do we need to do to rethink, and what are your views on how that plays into educational reform and systems reform when we think about the economic outcome many people need in order to continue their educations?
Look, I'm going to say one thing, but I'm going to then flip the question on you. Again, in the vein of we actually have the tool, financial literacy, it can be taught, it is being taught, it is not being taught anywhere near systematically. So again, when you look at the trajectory of school standards, remembering that once upon a time they used to teach Latin, and consider it fundamental, and maybe it is, but our whole evolution, we have shown that we can move. We can go from having no public education system to having a public education system to working to get it to reach kids younger. We have shown that we can move with our curriculum. Well, if we're going to move and evolve now, for example, financial literacy should be mandatory and should be consistent over time, because you can't teach it in a single course, to say the least. But what is more foundational to a child being able to be life-ready, as you said, not just career-ready, life-ready? So again, the boldness to say, you know what, there's no sin in rethinking the whole God-forsaken model, and constantly updating. In fact, it's exciting. One of the things we found in New York, we kept tinkering with the model, and it energized people. Of course, there's going to be bureaucrats and those who are a little worried, and some people say there's good things in the ways it was done before, and there always are. But I have found that even in the largest organizations, people get energized when their ideas have a chance and they get to test new things. And think about, I bet a lot of people in this room could sketch it out right this minute, what real financial literacy preparation would be for kids, how early it would have to be, how often it would have to be, so that a kid walks out the door at 18 and actually knows how to manage the foundation of their life, their finances. Now, I want to come back to you, because you literally, and I want to brag on Gerald, there are tens of thousands of good young people, and some who are a little less young now, who are walking around in this country and doing great work because this guy and his team found them, reached them, showed them they could, gave them the tools, gave them the support. And you said something really powerful before about listening, asking how they are. After a lifetime of getting kids on that path of support, what have you learned that you want everyone here to know that you think we all need to be working on?
First of all, thanks for the question. I think that the things I hold near and dear are, you can't feed your brain until you can feed your belly, right? And we did something in this country that was, again, pretty cruel. In the 80s and 90s, we said, if you don't go to four-year college, you're kind of a loser. We literally, we created a system that says you are worthy, you are not, based on four-year degrees, and then we priced education so highly that you couldn't get access to it. In fact, the only cost that's gone up greater than healthcare in this country is higher education. Imagine that, right? And so I guess what I've learned at Year Up, and we've learned after serving 40,000 young people, is if you start with the assumption that our young people are capable, smart, motivated, and want to do well. So you have to change your beliefs, right? When you look at a young person who may have come from a challenging background, do you see economic asset or do you see social liability? And a lot of folks in this country didn't believe our young adults could achieve at the highest level. So if you start with believing in that young person, and then you support them, right? You combine high support and high expectations. You help them learn something there's a market for, and then teach them the simple, the attitudinal, behavioral, communication skills you need to exist in a work world. Our young adults absolutely blow it out of the water. And we've seen this in every community in the country. We're in 30 different cities. We work with students, 15, 20% coming out of foster care, who've been in the criminal justice system, who've had severely challenged families. And guess what? If you expect a lot from them, you're respecting them fundamentally. If you're saying you deserve that opportunity, because this isn't about can young people do it. It's how do they feel, right? People think, oh, you teach folks to shake hands and put on ties, and I'm saying, you have no idea what we do. We teach young people to realize they are worthy, they are capable, have self-efficacy. You need that if you're going to be successful in this work world, and that's where we fundamentally help people learn. So we have this huge pool of talent in our country, and we somehow think, let's sort people out by a 4-year degree, and then some get a good job and some don't. And we have millions of young people there, and I want to also compliment the Governor Polis. Colorado has been as good as any state in the country on workforce. I mean, if you want to learn about workforce, go talk to the governor's people. They're some of the best in the country and done a great job to rethink how that system works. So we know that if the adults start to change their behaviors, once they change their beliefs, we can fix this. Now, I just want to do one little test. This is interesting. Raise your hand if you have a 4-year degree. All right, keep it up if you got it between the ages of 18 and 22. Governor, I'd suspect about 95% of these hands are still up. If you ask those same 2 questions of all of the adults in this country over the age of 22, what percentage of hands will be up? 95% of our hands were still up. What percent of those hands would be up if you ask those same 2 questions of every adult in this country over the age of 22? What percent do you think? Shout out a number. 20, 30, 15. 9 hands would be up, people. 9 hands would be up. 91% of adults in this country do not have a 4-year degree that they got between the ages of 18 and 22. Yet we say, you're not worthy if you didn't do this. Let me tell you, education is going to shift older. BAs are going to keep going up. People are going to need to get economic stability and credentials that give them labor market activity whilst they continue to learn throughout their lives. And we, the adults, have to reconceive of a system that caters to the traditional student, which is the student who works and goes to school at the same time, not the person who was privileged to go to school at 18 and graduate at 22. That's the untraditional student in America. So we have to rethink the systems have been designed incorrectly based on our self-image, often the 95% we're creating policy. We ain't the ones that should be creating policy. We should be listening to folks who live a different reality in this country and create systems that benefit and privilege them. Then you're going to have a better democracy.
You know, but I want to just key in off of this. Anyone who's worked in education knows how charged these discussions get. And I think one of the problems we face is, you know, you think about systems change, why is it so intimidating? And part of it is because I want to see a show of hands of this. I believe in all the public issues out there, and in the context of the entire American political debate, I believe the most emotional issue is education. Who agrees with that statement? I think it is the passion, the emotionality, the kind of arm camp dynamics that exist, the culture wars that inhibit trying to believe we actually could get to systems change. Yeah. But you know, you and I had an interesting conversation earlier about where does it come from, and you know, change comes from the ground up historically. So many of the great changes in our society began with thinkers and social movements on the ground that eventually moved policymakers. But I'd like to urge us all to not believe system change is beyond our reach. You know, when we go back to those really fascinating moments, the 1930s, the 1960s, when the country was really evolving rapidly in terms of our approach, there was a broad sense that we could do things and we could reorient in a really big way, and we did. That whole mythology about the 60s and the moonshot and, you know, ask what you can do for your country, a lot of that actually happened, right? And so I do think that we can regain a lot of that if we say how exciting it would be to reorient this whole thing. And it's not, and instead of it being scary or contentious, I mean, I love the notion of there could be a revolutionary generation, including the people in this room, who say, we're just going to go and reopen this book and reset this equation.
And so we're at ASU+GSV. What's the role of the private sector in this equation?
I'm going to say it bluntly. A part of the role of the private sector is to respect the public sector. which I think happens sometimes and doesn't happen other times. It's to understand that the change has to happen from the grassroots and it has to be led by the public sector to actually achieve. But that said, the private sector could be immensely helpful in terms of course, the great capacity that's been created in terms of training and the good parts of educational enhancement that could be done online. There's a whole set of tools and capacities. I am most excited by the notion of the private sector working with individual schools, but not assuming that means the school becomes a vassal of the company. Truly going into schools with a two-way street, knowing that you're going to help develop talent that your company will need, but you're going to give of yourself, whether, everything, tutoring, mentoring, everything, helping the school to be better. I think there's an immense possibility there. But again, with deepest respect to my colleagues in the private sector, the ground rule has to be kids first and respect the decision of public leaders in a democratically elected context.
You have concerns over AI in education?
I have immense concerns over AI in education, and I have immense concerns over AI, and I think it's time for a real discussion on this. And again, this is one so interesting. I've talked to really great and interesting people here these last few days. I've heard something that we should all be a little worried about. I've heard people say, well, AI development is, super rapid. It's going to change our lives profoundly, and it's already so far developed that we just need to sort of deal with it, which is unlike anything I've ever heard about in history about the creation of a both potentially powerful and positive in some ways, but also in other ways, bluntly dangerous technology. I'll use the most raw analogy. We didn't say in the development of nuclear weapons, like, hey, it's going to be great, let's open source it, and whoever wants to do it, you go do it. And again, I'm not being too flip here when I say AI can be of tremendous good, but there's also inherent dangers in AI that deserve a robust public debate and deserve the consideration of what would it take to create the guardrails, to create the transparency, the regulation, the sense of liability, that if you're creating something, you have accountability for the outcomes. None of this exists right now. So I think it's become disempowering to people that this massive change is happening beyond us and without us. That said, strangely enough, the best thing that happened to foster democracy was ChatGPT, because it got everyone focused and it freaked a lot of people out, especially when the one example of the New York Times reporter, when the program started telling the reporter that it was in love and leave your wife, which is one of those really eye-opening moments about perhaps the machines can feel and think more than we thought. But the point in all this is it's good people are paying attention. Now, what does a regulatory framework look like? And it's almost a perfect parallel to the conversation about education systems. We should not be afraid to say, hey, our systems are off, our systems are broken, so we will be the authors of new systems. That's how history has always gone. That's how betterment has always been achieved. With AI, the fact that it is so distant and complex should not be a reason for us to surrender to it, but to say there's a lot of good here. We need to get that good. But we are going to decide the ground rules, not a group of nameless, faceless people in a building somewhere in California. We're going to set the ground rules as a democracy.
I love it. First of all, that's very helpful. And I want to conclude by first saying thank you. Thank you for your public service, the job you did on behalf of New York City, the children in New York City, and just being a servant of the public. We appreciate and thank you for that. And thank you for your thoughts, your comments, perspectives today, Mayor. You're a wonderful individual, and we appreciate having you.
I want to say to everyone out there, thank you for the work you do. I imagine it is not, you don't get a surplus of thank yous for all of you who are educators. And all of you who are supporting educators in any way, thank you. My final point I'd like to make, we went through the pandemic in New York City. We were the epicenter of the country. We asked our school staff and our educators and our parents to create a remote system, a totally universal remote system for 1 million kids out of nowhere, and then turn around and come back to school and make that work. And then actually people did it with incredible devotion. And you heard the stories of the controversies, but the story you really should hear about is the folks who made it work and were selfless and were just there for our kids through thick and thin. And that makes me very, very hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.